Otskara everyone. In today's video, I came across a Reddit post recently about not being able to think as a programmer. And I thought about it. It's kind of a different process to be able to break things down. I don't know if it's like a natural thing or something that I learned, but I can understand how some people would have trouble with that concept of breaking down a problem or an application and being able to build it. So I thought in this video I'm just going to go through my process of breaking down an application or problem, and like methods that you can also use to help you in the future. Okay, how to break down a project and get started. So to build anything, you need to know what you're building. So find an idea. I would probably suggest not making your own idea first, because you have to understand the limitations of scope, and if you're making it yourself, it's very, very easy to continuously add features and then never be able to finish the application or game or command line interface, whatever you're building. Because it's yours, you can keep adding and adding and adding. If you take someone else's starting point and you say this is their end goal, then you can decide what you want to build out of that idea. It's also much more like a real world situation. If you are a developer, you're going to have stakeholders, and they're going to control majority of what app you're going to build. So you can use it as a way to interpret requirements of the application as well. Alrighty, where do you find these app ideas? Well, one of the places I love, and one of the new places I've been going to, so Behance is really, really good for finding pre-made designs of just any sort of application or any sort of website or game, or lots of inspiration there. So if you're interested in just taking something and you don't want to have to go through designing it first, just go to Behance, find something, which we're going to do in this video, and then build from there. The other one is r/app ideas, which is people on Reddit creating brief summaries of an app idea, which you can then build. That might be a little bit more difficult because you still have to design it, but there'll be a lot more variety and so less visual components if you want to do more like command line interfaces. So I'm just going to go to Behance. You can see here this beautiful calculator design. It's a little bit different. It's got that new sort of style that they have here for the buttons, and it's got a dark mode, light mode. Pretty stock standard calculator, but beautiful nonetheless. Okay, so let's get into thinking like a programmer. Something that I found was very, very helpful for me was separating out the logic of an application from the view or whatever the actual user sees. This was very, very helpful for me because I could focus on one singular thing at a time, and it really helped understand how those two worlds come together to build applications. It also helps you build anything outside of what you originally designed. It's not like it's a Python app or it's a HTML app or it's a game. You can really, because the view, what the people see, can be completely different depending on what you want. So you could build a music app, and then instead of creating an interface for it, you create a terminal interface for it. But the logic could be identical. The way that people interact is different. So I've gone ahead and thinking about the calculator that we looked at just before. You can see I've separated logic, which is often referred to as domain if you're trying to do some Google searches, and the view, what the user sees, into two separate areas, just for some basic notes. And then in the middle I put the interactions, because that's really where the interactions go in terms of this sort of paradigm. So let's go through the view, and then I'll switch back to the web. You can see what I'm talking about when I say it. So we got dark mode, view is black. We go here, and you can see we have this little toggle here, and there's a black version and a white version. We've got the math functions shown on screen. So here we've got the math functions here. They're showing. So this information is shown on screen. It has to be stored somewhere, otherwise you can't show it on the screen. And the result is shown on screen, which is of course this element here, like a regular calculator. And that's the main views, like a general overview. Of course there's things like buttons and other stuff like that, but I wanted to just go over a couple of elements to sort of give that example of what I was thinking. And then we have interactions. Haven't written anything for this. It's not important right now. And our logic, which is of course applying the math functions and the logic to know when should the application be white, when should the application be black. Okay, so moving on to the next point. Based off what we just talked about, we can think about how a user would use the application and break that down into those categories we just talked about. So how do people use the calculator? Well, they press buttons. That's about it. So our interaction is going to be user press buttons, and that's the most important interaction in this application. But to achieve a user presses a button, we need two separate things, right? We need buttons to be shown on the screen. So our view we have to know how to put buttons on the screen. So if you're still learning and you're not sure where to start with a feature, by doing this, it really helps you break down what you need to learn out of that function. So if you want people to be able to click buttons, first you need to know how to show buttons on the screen. Then when a user clicks a button, what happens? And in the logic layer, we have the data is stored, because as we saw before, the data is stored here and shown on the view. So to be able to have the 74, they have to remember that 74 was clicked in the past. So once we have those sort of that breakdown of how a user would use the app into those little areas, we can then start converting them into code, which I touched on just before. So the button, I've gone with the HTML button, and how do you attach a function or an interaction to a HTML button? It's the on click. But how will the logic know what's being pressed? You have to pass in the number of the button that's being pressed, which is 4. And then our function in the logic will be getting that number and saving it. How we save it, that's not really important right now. What we're trying to do is just understand the flow of that function, and then we can look at each step individually. This means if you get stuck, you can work on like the view layer and the interactions, and then work on the logic last, or you can remove a whole interaction section if you don't want to do any of that. You can remove the view. if you remove the view, then they can't interact with it, and then the logic doesn't matter. So if you want to remove functions, you can again think about it like that, take away the view, and then the interaction and logic are separate. And the last step, which is pretty, you probably get a bit beaten over the head with it, but start simple and iterate. This is a very popular diagram. There's another one which has like a skateboard and a car. But the general idea is that you have a very basic version of the application or game or anything, and then you iterate on that. And this means that you can release it sooner, and you can get feedback from the user sooner. But in this case, it's so you can finish a project. If you try and build a huge boat, and then you get stuck on like 1 or 2 functions, and you lose confidence and you don't continue, you're never going to learn all the other lessons you could learn by finishing that project. So I definitely recommend take an application. So if we go back to our calculator, maybe you don't know how to do this design perfectly in whatever language you want to do. An easy solution would be make an ugly version. Make it work first, which is ugly, and then don't concentrate on view, concentrate on logic and interaction. Then once it's finished, you can iterate on that view and make it better. Well, that's just my thoughts on how to think more like a programmer, how to break things down. I think it's very useful, especially if you're building front-end applications, but of course it can be applied to back-end where the view is not so important. It can be applied to games. I use the same technique when I build games. And yeah, I hope it was helpful. Feel free to write comments below, any questions or anything. And Janewani.